Continuing the Naked Civil Servant by Quentin Crisp. Chapter 9. When I was swept down into this second trough of destitution, I found myself, in general, worse off than when I had first come to London. But there were a few aspects in which my lot was improved. I lived on my own. It is hard enough to share wealth without being involved in undignified scenes. Shared poverty consists of nothing else. Alone, I could spread the little money I had to cover, or almost to cover, my vital needs, and I could decide, without that irksome effort toward consistency which I always make in the presence of others, just which underhand dodges I would attempt, and which were so risky as to be beneath me. After a while my morality came to rest at a level at which it has remained ever since. If I saw someone ahead of me in the street drop a pound note, I would overtake him and give it back. But if I found a pound note in the gutter, and had no idea to whom it had belonged, I would certainly not take it to the nearest police station. I imagine most people come gradually to some completely illogical code of this kind, and describe themselves as reasonably honest. Another way in which things were now better than they had been in King's Cross was that instead of receiving every week 14 gilt-edged shillings from my mother, I drew 15 shillings 3 pence from the taxpayers, who, though they complained more, could afford it better. Getting the money was one of the ways in which life was harder. The Pentonville Labor Exchange looked like a vast one-story barn, and issuing appropriately from it, I always heard a bellowing sound. This was the noise which, as soon as I appeared on the horizon, was set up by the 4-deep queue that permanently surrounded the building. The lowing was sustained fortissimo during the whole time that I was inside the building, and only died away as I disappeared around the corner of the street. To such a din I was already more or less inured. What came as a shock was having what modern tube travelers call the rush-hour technique practiced in a spirit of mockery upon my person. While I was in the middle of the queue, both hands were fully occupied in fending off the fumblers, who were busy fore and aft. It was a mercy that I was able to press my genital organs firmly against the counter at the moment when one hand had to be released for the purpose of signing the book. Only the eternal presence of 2 policemen, one at each door of the building, prevented a fight. One day, after weeks of this ritual, a solemn but benign figure appeared on the other side of the counter and beckoned me. The tumult and the shouting died. The moving fingers left my fly buttons. A clerk lifted up the flap of the counter and pointed toward the doorway through which the manager had receded. His office was very small, and apart from his own desk, it was crowded with at least 3 others. At these clerks sat, with their heads bowed, and their pens poised a fraction of an inch above their work. I do not think a single figure was written while I was in the room. The ruler of the Labor Exchange motioned me to sit on a chair in front of his desk and began to address me in a magisterial but kindly voice. "I came out to see what all the noise was about," he said. "I suppose you know it's on account of you." Me. Yes, sir. Ruler. I see we have you down as an engineer's tracer. Do you think, looking as you do, that you are likely to get work of this kind? Me. I would like to find work as a commercial artist. While employed by the electrical firm, I had attended evening classes in life drawing and illustration at the Regent Street Polytechnic. The principal of St. Martin's School of Art had refused to admit me, saying that it was a miracle that I had a job at all, and that I had better not try to change it. I now mentioned these studies in the hopes of seeming serious-minded. I said it might be a little less unlikely that I would find work in a studio than in an office. My inquisitor agreed. He couldn't stop himself from asking why I had adopted such a peculiar appearance. Then not only the pens, but the pulses of the surrounding clerks stood still. Ruler. Why do you go about looking as you do? Me. Because this is the way I am. I wouldn't like you or anyone else to think I was ashamed. He must have been a truly enlightened man, for though we were still stumbling through the sexual darkness of 1933, he did not ask me what I meant. He said, "I think you're making things very difficult for yourself." Then he rose to his feet, and I to mine. "You had better go out by this door," he added kindly, escorting me to a staff entrance. When I turned in the doorway to thank him, he said, "If it all gets too much for you, come and see me again. I will see what I can do." As he uttered these words, he placed his hand on my shoulder, a gesture which, in the circumstances, amounted to a daring vote of confidence. He was the first official ever to treat my problem as at least real to me. The 15 shillings 3 pence, which through his beneficence I drew from the Labour Exchange for 6 months, had to be eked out very carefully. I took a room, the rent of which was 6 shillings a week, in a Clerkenwell house which belonged to a superannuated policeman and his wife. They were typecast. I could almost see on her hands the flour from the first pie with which she had lured her husband from his beat down the area steps into her kitchen. The attic which they let me was long enough to lie down in, but would not have been wide enough for that purpose, and was too low to stand up in. A 6-foot man would have died of lumbago. The furniture consisted of a bed as narrow as a coffin, though not as peaceful, beside which stood a washstand with a jug and basin on it. At the foot of the bed was a little table with a chair placed so that a man of no cubic capacity whatsoever could sit there. But not only could no one, however starved, have made use of the chair where it stood, he also could not sit on it anywhere else. It could not be extricated from its position without the whole place being dismantled. The room had a window through which I could squeeze myself onto the roof. Here in the better summer weather I used to lie on the foot-wide parapet that ran around the top of the house. I hoped I would go to sleep and fall into the street below. I never did. Even a cheap death is hard to come by. After paying my rent, I had 9 shillings 3 pence left, of which a shilling a day was spent on food. On weekdays I could eat a midday meal for this amount in a dining room near Euston Station. It was run by a big blonde woman, whose conversation was a sort of ad-lib trailer for Coronation Street. I used to go to her restaurant after the lunch-hour crowd had left, and before the food had had time to get cold. She gave me whatever food she wanted to get rid of, saying that all the other dishes written on the blackboard had not turned out very nice. "Cut it on the bias," she screamed down the service lift shaft to her husband. This he certainly did. At every meal I leveled to the ground 2 pyramids of food that would have daunted a pharaoh. Throughout my life, the amount of food I ate was a cause for incessant criticism by my friends. At first, I used to point out in a whimpering voice that most of my acquaintances only saw me in cafes, where, since I sat in them from noon to nightfall and sometimes beyond, the least I could do to appease the proprietors was spend money. Later I grew tired of defending myself. I take it to be axiomatic that people are revolted by witnessing the shameless gratification of an appetite they do not share. To this rule, the proprietress of the 1 shilling diner restaurant was an exception. If the place was empty, she abandoned the work of cleaning up to sit and watch me eat. Her kindness was an absolute genuine emotion based on the snobbery of the times. In spite of my astonishing disdain, I had still not succeeded in shaking off my former roommate. This was just as well. He had discovered both the attic and the dining room, which now made my existence possible. We often ate together, but, though his airs and graces were far less pronounced than mine, the proprietress did not like him. She fed him well, but spoke of him badly. "It's different with you, love, but him! Why, some of the lads round here went to school with him." She felt that he should have spoken the same language as they, and not tried to deceive her into treating him with respect. This attempted imposture made him unworthy of extra helpings of jam roll. I have no way of knowing that she did not disparage me to him when he was there alone, but as far as I could see, she was pleased with me. I was a real gentleman. This by itself would have been but little recommendation. What mattered was that I was of high degree, but at low ebb. Every ladleful of mashed potato that she sloshed onto my plate, in her heart she flung into the face of the existing social order, not with imprudence, but with a kindness that not even Christ, the gentleman with the longest hard-luck story of them all, could disapprove. She became for a moment the superior of her superiors. This attitude of mine was one of the two great snobberies by which I was amazed to find that I could profit. The second was the common man's reverence for the arts. Art, by which the people who used the word always meant painting, was in those days sacred. It had not yet fallen into disrepute by becoming a game that any number could play. It was not a profession by which a great deal of money could be made. It was still a divine madness which caused the possessed to grow their hair long and lead lives of unalleviated poverty. Once, when I fainted in an express dairy, the manageress almost carried me downstairs to a part of the restaurant that was not used in the evenings. There she fed me with her own hand, as though I were a pigeon, only rarer. "You're an artist, I expect," she murmured. "You don't always remember to have regular meals." I gave her a wan smile of gratitude, and, touched by her sweetness, paid my bill. Later, when I lived in Chelsea, which was proof positive that I was not of this world, this deference to art often saved my skin. As I stood pressed against the railings of some dim London square with a stranger's hand at my throat, or my crotch, or both, another member of the gang would whisper, "But he's an artist. I seen him in Chelsea." Immediately, the grip on my person would loosen, and in a shaken voice my aggressor would say, "I didn't know." The art that I practiced at this time consisted of rearranging the position of the words "Sea View" on the letterhead of some boarding house in Brighton. This it did not seem necessary to mention. When I had eaten my sixth huge meal of the week in the dining room by Euston Station, there was, in theory, if no disaster, such as having to buy a piece of soap had overtaken me, 3 shillings 3 pence left for buying Sunday dinner. When many years after this time a friend of mine went to Israel to keep house for a doctor, she wrote and asked if I knew of any recipes that required no stove and no food. I couldn't help her, and I couldn't help myself when I lived in Clerkenwell. I had no idea how to live cheaply. I used to buy a loaf of bread, a pint of milk, and a hunk of black chocolate so hard that the confectioner could only break it with a small axe, which possibly he kept solely for this purpose. These provisions I consumed lying on my bed, which I seldom left for the whole weekend, unless lured out by other people's food. It is easier to starve supine than erect. That was how I spent Saturday and Sunday, when things had gone well. Quite often I had by this time already been bullied by the local boys into parting with several pennies, or worse, a sixpence. Even those who had seen me at the labor exchange were not above begging from me. In spite of my intense interest in these men, I never came fully to comprehend the attitude they adopted toward me and my kind. This may partly have been because I feared and desired and sentimentalized them. It may also not have been their intention that I should understand them. If I was busy trying to seem mysterious and aloof to them, we must not rule out the possibility that they were reciprocally engaged. The denomination of the homosexual religion is quasi-normal, and the same exaggerated and oversimplified distinction that separated men from women in the outer world ran like a wall straight and impassable between the roughs and the bitches. I was over 30 before, for the first time, I heard somebody say that he did not think of himself as masculine or feminine, but merely as a person attracted to other persons with male sexual organs. A confession of this nature would still bewilder and perhaps anger some of my homosexual friends. Quite recently, a male prostitute of my acquaintance, on one of his amateur nights, picked up a young soldier, only to find at the crucial moment that he had lumbered himself with a passive sodomite. And all of a sudden he turned over. After all I'd done, flitting about the room in my wrap, making him coffee, camping myself silly. My dear, I was disgusted. I made him get up and put on his clothes again. Whether he did, in fact, make the soldier get out of bed the instant the awful discovery was made is beside the point. The speaker wished all those who heard this tale to appreciate how clear a moral distinction there was between him and certain other people to whom sex is a mere pleasure mechanism. This point would have been understood immediately by the homosexuals I knew in my Clerkenwell days. They were all pseudo-women in search of pseudo-men. To this idea the roughs undoubtedly pandered, either permanently because it was part of some self-congratulatory idea they had of themselves, or temporarily whenever they were with us. They consciously tried to embody the myth of the great dark man which haunts the dreams of pathological homosexuals, and is the cause of one of their dilemmas. The problem is similar to the one that confronts heterosexuals who happen to be ever so for virgins. Recently, a letter was published in one of the women's papers asking how the writer should deal with her young man. He had told her that he would only happily marry a virgin. He pointed out that he could not possibly know for certain that she was pure unless he had sexual intercourse with her. This letter may, in fact, have been written by the editor, but it poses a riddle that men are only slowly ceasing to try to solve. The parallel problem that confronts homosexuals is that they set out to win the love of a real man. If they succeed, they fail. A man who goes with other men is not what they would call a real man. This conundrum is incapable of resolution, but that does not make homosexuals give it up. They only search more frantically, and with less and less discretion, for more and more masculine men. And because they themselves are, however reluctantly, to some extent masculine. Their judgment in these matters is for the most part physical. If you ask a homosexual what his newest true love is like, you will never get the answer he is wise or kind or brave. He will only say, "It's enormous." I think I should interrupt my reading and just repeat what I said at the beginning, that Quentin Crisp um, had his last installment of his autobiography published in 2017, and in it he did state that he felt that he was not homosexual, but he was a trans. He had always wanted to be a woman. So he might, if he wrote this again or revised it, want to change part of these. I do not know. I'm just a normal heterosexual kind of contented incel at this point. But just wanted to point that out. I don't know if this is a true, if he would be happy with this, what he had describing homosexuality, but we'll continue now. Though in the heterosexual world of the 20s and 30s, masculinity was sacred, the brand image of it had not come into its fullest flower in the minds of women. Their heroes were Rudolph Valentino and later Ivor Novello. It would have been delightful to know how the latter spoke in private of the parts which in public he played with such dash. In one play, to show how virile he was, he spat a piece of apple he was chewing onto the floor before demanding a kiss from a wicked woman in a low cafe in Montmartre. Wicked woman. But we don't love each other, do we? Mr. Novello. What the hell do we care? They kiss. Curtain. This was masculinity, stalking toward the deliciously quivering stalls. Another thing that may have prevented women from coming out openly in favor of unretouched masculinity was that love and marriage in those days were still confused in their minds. They could only stretch out one hand toward the untamed male. With the other they were preventing the escape of someone whom they regarded as a suitable husband, a person of the same class, size, age, and nationality as they. Homosexuals do not need to divide their attention in this troublesome way. They can clutch with both hands the myth of the great dark man. Their choice, unless they suffer from some subsidiary kink, is guided by the desire to bolster up, with a number of contrasts, that dream of themselves which it is their one increasing purpose to maintain. To understand what kind of man they most admire, it is only necessary to guess what they wish they themselves were: young, frail, beautiful, and refined. Hence their predilection is for huge, violent, coarse brutes. Any of these characteristics that the roughs did not possess by nature, they could put on at a moment's notice as mating plumage. But they too had a problem. The exotic had for them a great lure based on its rarity. The idea of the orchidaceous woman was everywhere. Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich leaned down from the screen and shamelessly poured sequins over the heads of the dreamers in the cheap front row. But from the real lives of the working-class men, this element was almost totally lacking. The girls available to them were just like home. Parents in those days still had some say in what their daughters wore. Only prostitutes at the social level wore vermilion hair, gold eyelids, and green fingernails. The girl next door had to make a necessity of virtue. Men appeared to go along with this idea, but it was noticeable that, whenever pansies were in bloom, they couldn't resist doing a little window shopping. They must never admit to themselves, or to God, or to one another, that they even liked the company of homosexuals, let alone that trade with them was a pleasant pastime. Any attention that they paid to us had to be put in the form of an infliction. Such gestures as running their fingers through our hair were accompanied by insults about what a bloody awful mop it was. If they wished to make any more definitely sexual advances, these must be ruthlessly stripped of any quality of indulgence. I have known at least one heterosexual man who told me that, to be really satisfactory, all sexual intercourse must preserve the illusion of rape. So I was never able to decide how much of the inordinate interest taken in me by the Clerkenwell boys was due to sexual curiosity, and how much was what it seemed, hatred. I longed to know, but I soon had to deprive myself of the strong stimulus that their proximity provided. The danger was too great. Keeping out of their way was not easy for topographical reasons. A partial solution to the problem of how to avoid trouble at the hands of roughs would have been never to go out at a time when decent people were in their beds. Decency, however, must be an even more exhausting state to maintain than its opposite. Those who succeed seem to need a stupefying amount of sleep. Even by 10 o'clock at night, the streets of all the slum districts I ever lived in were empty of every living thing but toughs. To reach home at all after this hour, I had to pass some of them. The shortest route between the strictly comparative safety of the main road and my front door lay to the north, but this was the most densely populated part of the neighborhood. Therefore, in a sense, it was the most dangerous. If I had recently met with any trouble there, I used to try coming home through the quieter area to the south by walking up Roseberry Avenue and nipping into any of the dark turnings on the left when I judged that I was not being watched. The disadvantage of this plan was that, unless I went a very long way around indeed, I had to pass at the corner of Farringdon Road a coffee stall around which there was always a crowd of young men. One night, when I had just risked this hazard, I became aware that I was being followed by more than one person. I was in trouble. I lived every moment that I was out of doors in a state of feverish awareness. It covered only a limited area of human experience. Outside the field of my own safety, I was the least observant person. I could never give people correct street directions, nor describe places with any accuracy, even if they were landmarks that I passed every day. But if I heard strangers walking along the road behind me, I knew at once whether they just happened to be there, or whether they were pursuers. I could usually gauge how many members of the hunt were present, even though they might all be marching in step precisely for the purpose of deceiving me on this point. I could tell if there was a woman among them. The presence of a girl almost always meant that the situation was going to be less grim. Once I had made up my mind about all these details, there were automatically a number of rules that must be followed. I must never look back. I must on no account run, but must increase my rate of progress gradually. A pace of more than 4 miles an hour eliminates half-hearted murderers. Serious ones will at this point break into a run. You will then know for certain that your predicament is of the worst kind. Even when overtaken and addressed, with some such words as, "Who the hell do you think you are?" I seldom ceased to walk fast unless I was forcibly stopped. Then I would stand absolutely still and look at the person holding my arm. Sometimes a look, which must never be haughty, was enough to make them let go of my sleeve. If it was not, I would try an offer of money, whether they asked me for any or not. As of necessity the amount preferred was small, my aggressors frequently knocked it out of my hand. I was left with no other pacifying strategy than speech. I spoke very slowly and quietly. This had the effect of compelling my enemies to listen, but it was at best only a delaying tactic. While I talked, they remained silent, if only to enjoy the luxury of hearing themselves called sir. But even I could not prolong a filibuster indefinitely. As soon as I paused for breath, or by mistake asked a question, they started to work themselves into a frenzy by shouting, swearing, and laughing, a device that I am told is standard procedure in bayonet practice. One night this ritual had just begun when a taxi came down the street. I raised my arm, and to my amazement the taxi stopped. But as soon as I got into it, and the boys began to surge around, the driver realized what the situation was, and getting down from his seat, ordered me out of his cab. This was not what always happened. I have on similar occasions known a taxi driver to run considerable risk to himself and his vehicle by moving slowly but persistently forward through dense crowds that hammered with their fists on the sides of the cab while I was inside. I pulled as though they were reins at the leather straps which in those days held the windows of taxis shut. The taxi driver in Roseberry Avenue, either from caution or moral indignation, had no intention of making a gesture in my favor. He stood in the road and continued to demand that I get out. This I did not immediately do. One of the boys started to drag me out. It was foolish of me to allow this to happen, as, by resisting, I became part of the battle. As soon as I was in the street once more, the whole gang started to hit me from all sides. Almost immediately, I fell on my hands and knees in the gutter. For a second I wondered whether I could stay there forever, but fearing that I might be kicked, I staggered onto my feet and was at once knocked across the pavement by a single, more carefully aimed blow. As I leaned against the front of Finsbury Town Hall, covering my own equally ornate facade with my hands to try to prevent rivers of mascara from running down my cheeks, I said, "I seem to have annoyed you gentlemen in some way." At this there was a sound of genuine amusement, quite unlike the barking noise emitted by a lynching party. I knew that this was the moment to try to move away, though I could hardly see where I was going. As I lurched along the wall, voices shouted after me, but no one followed. Apparently, whatever point my enemies had wished to make had been established. The mysterious thing in all such occurrences was not that strangers, sometimes without a word being uttered on either side, attacked me. It was that they never killed me. Certainly fear did not restrain them. I never made even a pretense of defending myself, not because my behavior was modeled on Christian ethics, but because to try would only have provoked redoubled ferocity from my aggressors. And no one ever came to my aid. Also, these young men must have known that whatever they did to me, there would have been only the most perfunctory police inquiry into the incident. Yet, though on 2 occasions I have lain for a few seconds unconscious on the pavement, I was never damaged beyond repair. My assailants did not apparently require my death, nor even my disfigurement. This was why I concluded that a large part of their motive for attacking me was to release their sexual curiosity in a manner consistent with their heavily guarded idea of manliness. They were only slightly concerned with forcing me to accept their superiority. If this latter was their whole aim, then all those street brawls were a waste of time. I regard all heterosexuals, however low, as superior to any homosexual, however noble. Chapter 10. This skirmish must have occurred towards the end of my stay in Clerkenwell. By this time I was once again in a job. I remember that I had difficulty in forcing myself to go to work the following day. This was not because I felt ill. To my surprise, I found, when I awoke the next morning, that I was not suffering even from the slightest headache. My reluctance to step outside the front door was due to the fact that, when I looked in the looking-glass, which I did the moment I was fully conscious, I saw that one side of my face was an ashy gray, and the other the color of blackberry juice. I ought not to have worried about the comment that this might cause in the office. I should have known that I could rely on the Englishness of the English. No one said a word. This was probably not from lack of curiosity. One of the travelers for this firm told me that when the directors had given him lunch in the public house next door, the sole topic of conversation had been whether I did or whether I didn't. Nevertheless, they would have died rather than hear any of the details of my private life from my own two lips. They guessed, and they were right, that if they questioned me at all, no matter how flippantly, they would have had the whole truth forced upon them. This new job, like my first, was found for me by my mother. Digging ever deeper through older and older strata of friendship, she had unearthed the wife of a publisher whom we had known in Sutton. I had been to one of their hateful parties, during which, rather than play games in which somebody had to kiss somebody, I had sat in another room and played patience with cards, which I had had the forethought to bring with me. My mother, in a fragment of the voluminous correspondence which, now that she lived in farthest Devonshire, was her chief hobby, pleaded with this woman who nagged her husband, who coerced a printing firm with whom he did a lot of business, to employ me in their art department. I was not a success. I sat in an upper room and tried to adapt myself to the whim of a man so moody that most days passed in a silence unbroken even by greeting or valediction. On others he danced and sang with such vigor that, even if there had been any work to which my talents were equal, I could not have done it. The swinging of the lamps and the shaking of the floor would have prevented me. Some of his moodiness was, I think, due to his red hair, but more was caused by the burden that he carried on my behalf. As the head of our department, one of his duties was to take whatever work I did downstairs to the directors and explain it if he could. Doing this always brought down upon him humiliations that he could hardly bear. As a commercial artist, I was as hopeless as I had been as a tracer. Indeed, the qualifications were the same for both occupations: a slow pulse, good eyesight, and a minimum of ideas. The word slick, now a term of contempt, was then the highest praise. In all the long dark years that I was in or on the fringe of advertising, my work never attained any noticeable degree of this quality of high gloss. I was always compelled to spend hours retouching my lettering and hours more retouching the retouching until the paper was embossed with white paint. The words I had written could only be read by the blind. After a year watching me doing this, the red-haired artist gave notice. As he left, he said, "I feel I ought to say something, give you some advice, but the thing for you to do is to carry on just the way you do now. You're as meek as a bloody lamb, but down there," he jerked his 15-amp hair towards the floor, meaning in the boardroom, not in hell, "they know you don't care a damn about any of them, and there's just nothing they can do about it." He was wrong. I liked the directors. I had arranged to do so. I was secretly shocked to see stalking toward me naked what, in my first job, I had only seen heavily veiled: the senseless and implacable hatred that workers feel for their employers. This hostility was something to which I never grew accustomed. In my whole life, the only relationships with individuals, as opposed to crowds, that I took seriously were those that I managed to establish with the people for whom I worked. They paid me, and this raised them higher in my esteem than any amount of praise or protestation of affection ever could. In return, I was their slave. To the amazement, and sometimes the disgust, of my co-workers in various studios, I never attempted to introduce any quality into my work that might be over the head of my boss. Nay, I executed drawings that I knew to be of the utmost banality with positive gusto, for whatever is done for money is sacred. For the first 3 months in the printing firm, my employers and I were only engaged, not actually married, meaning that I was on approval. They paid me nothing. 3 times a week I was given permission to walk across London. It would have been madness to have spent a penny each way on fares, and sign on at the Labor Exchange. This was but one of the bewildering flashes in which the dark core of the mind of accountancy was revealed to me. On one of the many days on which there was little that I could do profitably sitting at my desk, I was sent out to buy a pair of scissors. I went to Selfridge's department store, which I felt that I understood. It was thence that my snacks had been sent to me at boarding school. I bought some scissors for 5 shillings. When I returned and told the girl who kept the petty cash book how much they had cost, she became distraught. "I can't put down scissors 5 shillings," she wailed. "You can buy a pair in Woolworth's for 6 pence." I tried to calm her by enumerating the ways in which the article I had bought was superior to anything sold at Woolworth's. While doing this, I happened to utter the words "paper shears." Her ivory brow smoothed out immediately. "Oh," she sighed, "I can put down paper shears 5 shillings. That's quite all right." I was delighted with this incident, but certain other features of the firm's economy were burdensome to me. The art department was supposed to pay its way. Its share of the rent, light, and heat of the building was added to my wages and the cost of art materials. This sum, I was warned, must be covered by the prices charged for the work, although we all knew that those art fees were frequently lowered until they were out of sight to make the printing estimate acceptable. The layouts were really nothing but appetizers. This and other monetary equations I endeavored to take seriously. I worked my brushes to the ferule. As the other members of the staff clattered down the stairs in the evening, they called back over their shoulders, "Are you staying all night?" The first person to arrive in the morning, finding me already there, asked, "Have you been here all night?" I gave a mocking laugh, but I had. The solvency of the art department so worried me that I tried not to sharpen my pencils too often. Such flights into the absurd may have been launched partly by the trance of malnutrition in which I permanently floated. Friends prophesied that I would be blown away by the first winds of winter. I swayed obligingly, but I did not grant their wish. I went on living. I went on working. The job meant a lot more to me than salvation from the fumbler's queue at the labor exchange. It hushed, even if it could not silence, the terrible things said about me by my relatives, which, though I never heard them directly, reached me slightly blurred on the great family intercom. Also, I felt that commercial art might become a permanent means of getting by. Being employed by the electrical engineers had only taught me how to ask where the gentleman's lavatory was without blushing. Now I was learning something which might be really useful. I never thought of my work as something that would one day earn me a lot of money. Squalor was my natural setting. I did not hope that a job would extend me to the limit of my talents. I hadn't any. What I wanted, to rest from regular employment, was something with which to bargain with the heterosexual world for acceptance as a homosexual. This evangelical zeal was the real motive for everything I did. It would subside for a while and then flare up again, especially if my employer had recently called me into his office and made another attempt to coerce me into altering my appearance. Without looking at me and moving the papers on his desk from side to side, he would say, "The fact of the matter is, we don't particularly like employing people with plucked eyebrows and pointed fingernails." For a week or two my eyebrows, which usually marched across my forehead in single file, were allowed to form fours, and the style of my fingernails was changed from Gothic to Norman. Surprisingly, I was not dismissed. On the contrary, the day came when I was given an assistant. Thinking only of the havoc that an extra £2 a week in wages would wreak on the firm's economy, I at first protested at this daring expansion. The directors, laughing heartily, pointed out how inconvenient it would be for them if, while I was the only member of the art department, I were to become ill or get run over by a bus. I asked them to provide me with a female assistant. I foresaw that there would be mutiny if a man were ever placed in a position where he had to do as I said. Whether my employers saw the sense of this I never knew, but they pandered to my whim and engaged a charming girl, with whom I worked happily for about a year. This was the first time I had ever been in the position of a master instead of a slave. I tried to behave with the utmost tact so as not to inflict on my assistant any of the humiliations that had been heaped upon me. One day, however, presumably because of some special pressure of work, when she held a drawing up for my approval, I said, "Yes, that's all right, but the feet are bad." No sooner had these harsh words passed my momentarily unguarded lips than I hastened to soften their directness with chivalrous obliquities. "What I meant was," I began, "that certain superficial critics might say—" At this point she cut me short. "Thank God," she sighed, "you've said what you really meant at last." In all, I was 4 years with this firm, earning for my last few months there £3 a week. Then the business was sold, and I sensed that, for all their courtesy, my new bosses were waiting for me to go. For the first time in a long while, I took a look at the outside world. To my delight, I found that the storm had largely abated. Jobs were no longer hard to get. Now they were only hard to keep. Chapter 11. While I had not been watching, a number of tiny studios had sprung up at the tops of narrow buildings in Fleet Street and Chancery Lane. They had rather intimidating names like the 20th Century Advertising Service or the New London Studios. If I burst into any of these offices, I usually found two people playing table tennis in a nest of dirty teacups and the crumpled drawings of forgotten art students. One of the players would turn out to be the managing director, and the other his staff. They didn't look pleased with my interruption of the day's business, but now they would nearly always give me their attention for a few minutes, though this was frequently directed more at the artwork I had done on my face than at anything in my book of specimens. When I had first come to London, I had seldom got as far as undoing the arm-splitting portfolio I then carried. During the next 2 winters, I worked in some of these studios, whose staff could barely be seen with the naked eye. In the summer, the tide of advertising always mysteriously receded, leaving all firms but those with the deepest roots high and dry. In this period of drought, someone from all these smaller concerns had to be asked to leave. This was always me. My feelings on being dismissed were a mixture of indignation and relief. By the time I was 28, I had tired of this experience. I found a way of preventing its recurrence. I gave up work. I became a freelance commercial artist. I reached the Canaan of all the more optimistic art students of that time. Unlike modern students, none of those who were with me at Battersea Polytechnic ever thought of becoming a teacher. The girls gloomily guessed that they would go into lampshade factories and die there, unless, before the red-sailed sampan or the pear with russet leaf got them, they managed to marry. They seemed to realize that this was a desperate choice. To St. Paul, marriage was barely preferable to hell. To women, though these two states may be the same, either was more to be desired than work. The male students tried to creep into studios or agencies, but only as a stepping stone to those bright fields where they would work for themselves. From the very first week of their employment, they started to collect printers' pulls of every brush stroke that they made, a tailpiece, a decorated initial. These they kept under their drawing boards and fingered when the barrage of contemptuous criticism was loudest. I cannot claim that from this moment I was always happy, but from the age of 28 I never did for long anything that I didn't want to do, except grow old. I was elated by my freedom, but I was anxious. Being a freelance commercial artist would be taxing for anyone. For a person with no talent, it was hazardous. I became a little man around the corner of advertising. I called on all the clients listed by all the studios I had ever worked in, and offered to produce the same style of drawing as that to which they were accustomed, but more cheaply, more quickly, and worse. This ruse worked admirably then. It would be of no avail now. During the course of my lifetime, advertising has altered completely. In that happy time when I first became a freelance artist, advertising was a disgraceful trade. The confession that it was your chosen profession was received as though you had said, "I'm in burglary." It was run by businessmen who were presumed to have failed in more reputable concerns, and staffed by artists and copywriters who felt that they were exiles from fine art and literature. Their function was to think up the atrocious pictorial and verbal puns, jokes, and riddles, Shelia Dore drinking Oxo, that appeared on the billboards. Then, at some time during the next few years, advertising became the great tax evasion racket, and everything began to change. Instead of nagging their agencies to do more for them, manufacturers began to implore them to think up ways of using up their vast appropriations. Even I, who never worked in any large advertising concern, was later to attend a meeting at which a client said, "But even if these counter dispensers are invoiced at £2 each, and we foist one of them on every one of our commissionaires, that will only use up about £2,000. We must get rid of 20,000 before the beginning of April." When this way of thinking became fashionable, advertising began to grow rich and attract an entirely different kind of employee, university graduates, who brought with them a new ambiance of fatuous elegance. If today you call on an up-to-date agency, to hand in some copy for a 2-inch single-column insertion in the daily press. You trudge through carpets as thick as pampas grass in a room lined with gilt mirrors. There a young man waits to extend toward you in perfunctory greeting at least 4 inches of cuff, transfiguration white. It is hard to remember that you have not come to have your hair waved. In the 60s, if you tell anyone that you are a practitioner of advertising, you will still be treated as though you had said you were in burglary, but morality has changed. The increased scale of your operations will lend you respectability. Who, except possibly the Postmaster General, would refuse to shake hands with one of the great train robbers? If, during my brief career as a commercial artist, any of these complexities were beginning to proliferate in advertising, they disturbed the atmosphere at a level far above my head. I merely ran in and out of business premises, studios and printers' works, trying to persuade people to change their catalog covers, posh up their letter headings, or decorate their leaflets with catchphrases or thumbnail sketches. My problems were small and mostly purely personal. For anyone whose appearance is highly eccentric, it is usually first meetings that are a special ordeal. In the days when I had looked for regular employment, I had only the initial interview for each job to negotiate. Now that I was freelancing, I had to face several such challenges every week. Since I depended for my livelihood on the goodwill of whomever I had come to see, these situations needed to be handled with much greater care than confrontations with strangers in the street. I found it necessary to develop a technique for being interviewed. This came into operation the moment I arrived at the reception desk. It began with not evincing any surprise at all as the office boys fled through the doors nearest to them, firstly, in order to fall about the corridors laughing without restraint, and secondly, so that they might spread to distant floors of the building the news of my advent. Then, while I waited for my appointment, I had to invent some artificial occupation for my attention, so that it would seem natural for me not to look up as each member of the staff, carrying a meaningless piece of paper, came to speak to the receptionist. Finally, there was the interview itself. At the start of this, I must, by what actors call some piece of business, allow my client a good look at me, while I was not looking at him. I did not always succeed in giving him time to put his eyes back in his head before I turned my gaze upon him. Once the initial shock of seeing me had worn off, my interviewer was sometimes so relieved to find that I was not actually mad, or even in any other way unconventional, that he gave me work out of simple gratitude. A second visit was usually quite easy at top level, though by this time all the lesser personnel knew what to expect, and the glass panels of whatever doors gave on to the route that I must travel were cloudy with the feverish breath of typists. It was now that I realized fully that, while I was apprehensive of strangers, any of the girls who might be forced to come close enough to me to hand me an envelope were trembling so that they could hardly stand. I never found anything except time that would remove this reaction of stark terror. In order, at least, to reduce it to a minimum, I cultivated an air of politeness bordering on subservience. Very slowly I was starting to go through that process that usually only convulses adolescents. I was learning not merely to confront people, but to communicate with them. In the outer world in which I was now struggling to make a living, prosperity was gradually returning to England. In the inner world in which I lived more intensely, things were getting worse. Possibly the two opposing trends were connected. It was only in the idealistic dreams of H.G. Wells that people became nicer as they acquired wealth. What in fact happened was that as soon as men were released by affluence from the need for any unethical conduct themselves, they felt free to swoop down from their newly attained moral elevation upon the turpitude of others. To restore the self-esteem of which poverty had temporarily deprived them, the force of their condemnation exceeded the violence of any opprobrium that was formerly heaped upon them. In accordance with this rule, the fair name of vice was now being dragged through the mud by the English newspapers. It was hard to make dreary old fornication and adultery into news, so the press directed the hostile gaze of the public toward the deviants. About the private lives of these more and more facts and pseudo-facts were coming to light every week. At first I imagined that this increase of knowledge would herald the dawn of a new day, when the butch lion would lie down with the camp lamb. To my disappointment, I now realized that to know all is not to forgive all. It is to despise everybody. The first rumors about homosexuality that were now spread abroad brought only fear. They suggested that it was a much larger monster than had originally been suspected, devouring not only all ballet dancers and a few actors, but thrusting one claw in at the front door of the homes of apparently quite ordinary citizens. The cry went up that England was going to the bitches. The police, to show that they took this prognostication seriously, began to clean up the West End. Even when I had first discovered the Soho cafes, certain older male prostitutes were taking their amber cigarette holders from their lips to declare that nothing was what it used to be, that the police had ruined Piccadilly. But in those days detectives chased me and my friends through the streets chiefly to satisfy their own hunting instincts. That their quarry was supposed to be a menace to civilization was incidental. They mentioned it only as, when blood sports are being denounced, huntsmen drag in the fact that foxes are a nuisance to farmers. We were not taken seriously. We were thought to be the exposed part of a very small iceberg. The general estimate of the number and kind of men who might be interested in us was even less realistic. One of the first policemen who ever questioned me at a street corner, when he had decided to stand a little closer and change his bullying tone to accents of fatherly concern, warned me that the only people who would go with boys were men suffering from venereal disease. They would be ashamed to communicate this to a woman. He may not have believed this story himself, but he certainly expected me to. Such naive ideas as this were now no longer in fashion. Police methods were growing very much grimmer. The decoy system had become a nightly routine. Those of my friends who had previously dreaded that they might be hounded into jail now began to fear that they might be vamped into it. The main field of operations for this particular strategy were the dimly lighted public lavatories in the less populous areas of London. While one detective in plain clothes wandered about with vigilant unconcern on the opposite side of the street, his accomplice, selected by his superiors because his natural endowments made him specially suited to the work, stood inside the urinal, flashing, demonstrating his do-it-yourself apparatus to anyone who happened to come in. One cannot imagine how the kit inspection that would precede a stint of this duty would be conducted. The trap worked well, and by it many of the most unlikely people were lured to their doom. In modern times, when everyone knows about these maneuvers, they are falling into disuse. Common knowledge robs them of their effect. They also offend the sporting instinct of the British people. It is thought to be a dodge comparable with deliberately placing a diamond bracelet on the pavement and pouncing from ambush upon anyone who picks it up. Almost exclusively, it snared borderline cases. Those whose idea of a lovely way to spend an evening was to wander from one gents to another quickly learned to recognize a copper even by Braille. It was persons who had never heard of homosexuality, but whose perfectly natural curiosity was aroused by any odd manifestation of human behavior, who were in such danger from these police techniques. One can be sure that, even on a good night, merely to ask the constable what on earth he was doing would lead to an arrest. On a bad evening, a brief glance in his direction would be enough. But the worst result of the decoy system was that, in a policeman who did not happen to favor queers, being given the chore of making himself attractive to them rapidly turned his dislike into ferocious disgust. In return, homosexuals, who originally feared the police, which some would consider to be a good thing, came to despise them. From the law's point of view, the only weakness of the decoy system was that it took 2 constables to apprehend one sexual offender. This was a waste of manpower. The police thought of homosexuals as North American Indians thought of bison. They cast about for a way of exterminating them in herds. With the aid of informers, they discovered where the great drag dances were being held and turned their attention thither. These balls were organized by private individuals and held in any of the large banquet rooms that can be hired for parties. They couldn't, of course, be advertised, but no publicity was needed. The network always managed to reach anyone who might want to go and had half a crown to spare for a ticket. About 3/4 of the men who attended these dances were in drag. In a raid, 100 or more screaming, shrieking, fighting, kicking boys in feathered headdresses and diamante trains could be scooped, pushed, or flung into vans by a relatively small squad of policemen. Once, when I lived in Barron's Court, I traveled by underground to Piccadilly Circus wearing a black silk dress and some kind of velvet cape. I went to the Regent Palace Hotel, had a drink, and talked airily of this and that with my escort, who was, I think, in a dinner jacket. Then I returned home. The evening was a triumph in that it was boring. Nothing happened. Since then I have never worn drag. Its only effect on me is to make me look less feminine. In women's clothes, even a faint Adam's apple, even slightly bony insteps, are harshly conspicuous. I never attended one of these transvestite dances, but I very much doubt whether the charge brought against most of the guests, aiding and abetting an immoral performance, was founded on evidence. I suspect that they were very similar to the 2 or 3 drag parties that I have known. They were all exactly alike one another. At none of them was there much sin. There was only a great deal of hysteria. I have sadly to say that to me everything about homosexuals was endearing except their gaiety. Being at a party at which they were having a really good time was like seeing a silent film of the 20s, with all the staccato haste and all the frantic mime, accompanied by a soundtrack recorded in the parrot house at the zoo. I do not expect such parties are given any more. There is no need. Fancy dress has become national costume. When these dances ceased to be given because they became too dangerous to be worth the pleasure, the police began to bend their ireful brows on the queer clubs. To these no one in drag was ever knowingly admitted. An evening spent in one of them would almost always be quiet, even cozy. They were said to be places of assignation. They were, to exactly the same extent as are all public houses, clubs, and evening institutes. Who would go to a Morris dancing class if the only hope were that it would lead to greater expertise in Morris dancing? Indeed, is not the whole world a vast house of assignation, of which the filing system has been lost? These clubs were merely places where men could talk, drink, and dance together. It was the last pastime that so inflamed the imaginations of journalists. But though the foam dripped from their lips onto their typewriters as they worked, the word homosexual, by the constant use of which modern periodicals seek to make it known that they are serious-minded, was never written down for all the world to see. Even lesbians, generally thought to be not so sinful because they were less illegal, were not mentioned in so few words. Policemen. There were also present women of a certain class. Magistrate rubs his hands. Prostitutes? Policeman, in a lower voice. Of another class. Magistrate, after a long indrawn breath. Oh, I see. In spite of their tameness, all these clubs for homosexuals were raided sooner or later, and the cases that followed enlivened the pages of the News of the World and the People. The scandal of this kind that I remember best, because a commercial artist whom I knew was involved, concerned the Caravan Club. Proceedings lasted for a fortnight, at the end of which my friend, though sentenced to 2 weeks' imprisonment, was released on the grounds that he had suffered enough in the police court. The proprietor, a certain Mr. Neve, was clapped in for months. It is indicative of the oversimplified view of homosexuality that was still current that my friend took the trouble to persuade a young woman of his acquaintance to fluff out her hair and state in the witness box that she was his fiancée. This was supposed to make his visit to the club seem to have been a misguided sightseeing escapade. A present-day magistrate would merely think that the existence of the lady made matters worse. I went to 2 or 3 of these clubs in my more optimistic days, and observed that every year they grew more respectable, or at least more restrained. Even in the beginning, when they were slightly sordid, I never felt at home. The management feared that my arrival and departure might draw the unwelcome attention of officials. This I understood, but it was with pained bewilderment that I came to see that even among the clientele my arrival caused a hush, clamorous with resentment. I was beginning to meet a greater number and a greater variety of homosexuals, and having to face the fact that, almost without exception, they did not like me. Those who camped in private and watched their step in public felt that my not doing either was an indirectly expressed criticism of both these activities. They were right. Though the strongest resist the temptation, all human beings who suffer from any deficiency, real or imagined, are under compulsion to draw attention to it. To their doing this I could hardly object, since I was the living example of this obsession. But about camp, with its strong element of self-mockery, there seemed to me to be something undignified, even hypocritical. At its worst, it is a joke made by someone who acts in a certain way for laughs about a less fortunate person who makes the same gestures unconsciously. When I lived in Maida Vale in the flat of an invoice clerk, if I came into the kitchen and found him washing his socks, he could not have refrained from uttering some such phrase as, "A woman's work is never done." I longed to cry out, "You are washing your socks because they are dirty. The situation needs no comment." I never did. I needed the room. Even those who did not feel that I was secretly judging them were angry with me for presenting to the world, by those whose good opinion they set a great store, a brand image of homosexuality that was outrageously effeminate. This was resented chiefly by those who were effeminate but did not think of themselves as outrageous. Their objection was part of a much more widespread hostility to my putting forward any propaganda about the subject at all. Homosexuals generally did not look forward with pleasure to living in a world where the facts about their abnormality would be common knowledge, and where even the least sophisticated people would learn to think of it as a possible explanation for any odd behavior. An American actor expressed to me the view that obviously gay boys were spoiling it for the rest. I was dumbfounded by this remark, as to me it was not a pitch, but an illness. It was as though he had said that consumptives who coughed ruined for others all the fun of tuberculosis. Publicity is annoying to some homosexuals because they enjoy living incognito. This allows them to practice a hoax upon society, and particularly upon its women, and with whom they carry on teasing flirtations. This masquerade seemed not merely unpleasant because it was contemptuous of the girls involved, but ultimately incomprehensible, since the admiration or respect or love aroused were really for some other man of the same name. Possibly this perpetual confidence trick satisfied the hatred these men felt for the outer world. One fact became inescapable. Homosexuals were ashamed. They resented not being in the mainstream of life. The feeling varied from irritation to the anguish of irrevocable exile. It had little to do with God or the neighbors or the police. It was private and irredeemable. Finding that homosexuals didn't like me was harder to bear than the hostility of normal people. To the latter reaction I had become accustomed long ago. There was even a sense in which I welcomed the animosity of the public. It seemed to demonstrate the necessity of my continuing to hammer away at them. The coldness with which I was received by my fellow guests at small gatherings of the faithless was wounding in the extreme. I felt it amounted to ingratitude, as I thought of my life as a burnt offering laid on the altar of their freedom. I could not see that this was but a contributory cause of their unfriendliness. If people speak badly of those who have done them a favor for which they have asked, what will be the attitude of those who find themselves in receipt of a sacrifice for which they have loudly proclaimed they have no use? This was a question that I never asked myself. I merely accepted an ostracism made complete by the fact that, owing to increasing police vigilance, the proprietors of even the wickedest cafes would no longer let me in. I looked increasingly for friendship among normal people. I got their tolerance to the utmost test, not, as I imagined, by causing them to risk being involved in some wonderful scandal, but by never talking for long about anything but the social problems of my kind. Among those who now began to shoulder this burden was the wife of the unspellable Czech who had been brought to my room in Pimlico. She was an artist's model and dressed in accordance with the rigid dress laws of the time. She wore a vermilion polo neck sweater, curtain ring earrings, and a black beret balanced at the ultimate degree of obliquity. Her days were spent working in the art schools, and her evenings complaining of her husband, who, in her absence, pawned her gramophone. They were a lively pair who lived in Warwick Avenue. To them I introduced my art school friend. At the weekend, we often sat in the Czech's basement flat, talking of sex, and eating a kind of sea rack, produced by putting everything that guests brought into a huge saucepan that stood over the eternal flame of the studio stove. When no one brought anything, there remained the residual slime of past ages of prosperity. This we consumed with relish. In this and many other ways, Mrs. Check introduced into my life a new continental flavor. I had no way of knowing, and no intention of trying to find out, if foreigners were really more lax than the English in sexual matters, so I had at least to affect to believe her when she told me that in Paris, and she implied in all the glittering capitals in Europe, homosexuals, so far from being objects of ridicule, were barely noticed at all. She could not see why I did not either live flagrantly abroad or discreetly at home. She was sure the English would never abandon their condemnatory attitude toward me in particular, and sex in general. With all the other unfortunate people whom I had embroiled in endless screaming matches on this subject, there had at least been one point of agreement, that homosexuality was of the greatest importance. Mrs. Check merely thought of it as a minor, slightly curious fact of life. This disturbed my essential Puritanism. Every opportunity for pleasure that was offered to me automatically carried with it an almost equally strong desire to do without it. I might give way to either impulse, but the presence of the two contrary wishes was what gave zest to both. In 1653, when God took a turn for the worse, the gusto with which the English took to a life of self-restraint undoubtedly contained an element of debauchery. If we don't suffer, how shall we know that we live? One evening, while Mrs. Check was giving voice to her broad-minded views, and I was shaking my thin-lipped head, I had interrupted her for a moment while I went into the kitchen for a cup. As I passed through to the other room of the flat, I came upon Mr. Check and the art student clasped in a passionate embrace. Here were forces of permissiveness that not even Mrs. Check would have condoned. But Mr. Cromwell is not mocked. Soon the man in this sordid tableau was to go mad, and the woman to become a nun. I did not utter a word on seeing them, nor did my feet falter, but I was shaken by the revelation of two people whom until now I had regarded only as reflections of my own existence, in violent relation to each other. For the first time I was forced to admit that other people existed. It was not a discovery that I welcomed. Thank you for listening, and thank you for existing. And please like and comment and subscribe and do your Christmas shopping early.